I've been reading some of the Sermon on the Mount recently and come across the bit early in the piece where it talks about the disciples being persecuted. We Christians in the Western world at the moment certainly understand about being at least opposed. There's a great deal of shouting down. Rational discussion seems quite difficult. There are lots of insults and trolling. And many disciples are confused because the old ascendancy in society is no longer there. People are discouraged by this in some cases. And it's easy to use the weapons of the world to oppose all of this, but opposition gives opportunities for something different. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus provides some help for his disciples who are opposed. The Beatitudes that begin the Sermon on the Mount are addressed to the crowd as well as the disciples, but then in verse 11, Jesus speaks to you, to the disciples. This is the first teaching to disciples in Matthew's Gospel. It's concerning, in the first place, what Noland, in his commentary on Matthew, calls verbal abuse, persecution, defamation, because of me, because of Jesus. Jesus says, the disciples are blessed, like the prophets, who were also persecuted. But in verses 11 to 16, we need to ask the question whether this is one topic or whether they're separate sayings, because the persecution saying follows on to the story of salt and light. Now I want to suggest to you that verses 11 to 16 is one topic, not separate sayings. And the salt and light sayings help us understand about the opposition and the persecution. Now, there are a couple of difficulties with the salt saying. One is it's very difficult to understand how salt can be unsalted. And the other one is that the word that Matthew uses for being unsalted never means that. There's no use of it in that sense at all. It means something like foolish or mad or empty or something like that. So I take it that Jesus is being ironic when he talks about salt being unsalted. Saltiness is in the nature of salt, and the disciples are the salt of the world. You're the salt of the world, he says. Now, it may be that others think that they're foolish, useless. Maybe others think they ought to be trampled underfoot, but that isn't what Jesus thinks. Those people are mistaken. It's foolish even to think that salt should be thrown out or trampled underfoot. Of course, if it was unsalted, then you should do that. But Jesus, I don't think, thinks that is the case or should be the case. But there are people who want the salt thrown out, like the ones who persecuted the prophets, like the ones who opposed the disciples. And the disciples are like the prophets, at least in this, in that both of them are salt in the land. So what does salt mean? Well, it's expanded a little further in the Sermon on the Mount, through Matthew's Gospel. I suppose, putting it simply, being salt means being like your Father. So at the start of Jesus' teaching of his disciples, there's this surprising blessing of being opposed. That's not a good start, of course, if you were looking for safety and security and peace and prosperity. But instead, disciples, Jesus says, are to put themselves on display like lights on a hill. And the bit about light on a stand or a city on a hill is a parallel story to the one about salt. They're both talking about the same thing, which is the behaviour of disciples. Well, if you let your light shine, if you display your good deeds, will that result in more persecution? Well, it might. But Jesus thinks that shining your light will actually display the good deeds, and the Father will be glorified by them. And the people who oppose the disciples will also glorify the Father of the disciples. It's quite an interesting turnaround, isn't it, from verse 11? And it's one of the effects of being salt disciples. Persecution and opposition are not the whole story. More important is how to respond to it. Salt, light, good deeds, they're the way to go. Insulting the salt doesn't change its saltiness. In fact, the opposite is the case. Paul says later in Romans 12, Don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Sharing in persecution like the prophets results in rejoicing, Jesus says, because you're on the same team. You've got the same heavenly reward. And the mission of the prophets and the disciples is to bring change on the earth. Glory in heaven? Well, the Father is glorified, because these are the deeds of the Father.